why do you think that Knausgaard kind of interrupts the linear flow of the story like that?
Well, I think there is an intentionality in this, and I think part of it is alluded to in the Paul Becker, the poet, who we're sort of introduced to, and perplexes us a little bit about it. that poet's project and his insertion into the novel, and this idea of forms, which kind of reminds me of Plato's archetypes and perfect forms. There is this realm beyond our realm where everything is perfect.
Welcome back to the Big Book Project. I am so delighted today to have one of my favorite people and absolutely probably my favorite person to talk about books with. My colleague at Interabang Books, Richard Bailey, is joining. And Richard, you're pretty much the inspiration for picking this book for the Big Book Project. So thank you for that. It's been quite a ride so far. We're going to be talking about part 2 today, which is the reading for the week of May 3rd. And welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much. I'm both humbled and absolutely delighted to have something to do with this selection, and I can see just by the comments, the level of participation that people are really getting involved with this Knausgaard novel, and that's a delight in and of itself. To see the rigor at which people are putting to this and the interesting questions. I feel like it's terrific discussion, and I'm just so proud to be a part of that as well.
Yeah, it has been really terrific discussion. Even though people have commented from time to time that they're quite troubled by our protagonist, Kristian, and some of his uh, thoughts and actions, it certainly gives us a lot to talk about today.
Well, especially in part two, as we do see some different dimensions to Christian. I think Nosgard is smart rather than leave us, totally, at the disposal of this selfish and self-centered individual, which wasn't without, its interest. There is something compelling about, being in someone who's just has this idealized idea of where they exist as an artist and as a person, and their worldview is shaped by the appearances that come from, I guess, this inner idealization, and this necessary disconnect that would come from something like that. It is tragic to see. It has been painful at times to see. But I think in his interactions with Liz, we see something maybe a little bit more farcical in the sense that sometimes, he quickly, Christian does, loosens himself on some of these rigors. We know, for example, we've seen him take great care in the way that he selects his music, and how important music is to him. When Liz calls him out on his neighbor, when calls him out on, oh, I bet you're judgmental, but I bet you're the type of person who listens to, say, um, and she gives off a couple of band names, the Velvet Underground or Joy Division, and he immediately turns his back on these things. He says, "No, no, no, you can't possibly know what I'm into," even though we know that these are things that he loves, and even though he's aware that being a neighbor, she can probably hear the stuff that he's listening to, but nevertheless, he's very quick to disown some of his own values just for the sake of appearing right. There's something farcical about this. I think it's a little bit funny. And I know that in the last video, y'all talked about some parallels in that farcical content with the Master and Margarita. And I think that's, some of that is at place with Christian too. And of course, we get to see him again as a much older person in very different circumstances, as he's presumably writing out, what we see in book one. And now I'm
Yeah,
continuing the story in book two.
let's talk about how part 2 begins, because of course at the end of part 1, you know, Christian mysteriously is released from uh from jail. He seems to have been cleared of these charges of manslaughter that they had brought or were going to bring against him. And there, right outside, the first person he sees is Hans. And Hans says something along the lines of, "How do you like your freedom, Christian?" and and then part one ends, and we're left kind of on this cliffhanger. And then part two starts, and we're in a totally different place, and apparently with an older Christian. And I'm wondering, that section in part two, where we are kind of sped up to a future, is only maybe, I don't know, 8, 10 pages. Why do you think that Knausgaard kind of interrupts the linear flow of the story like that?
Well, I think there is an intentionality in this, and I think part of it is alluded to in the Paul Becker, the poet, who we were sort of introduced to, and perplexes us a little bit about it. that poet's project and his insertion into the novel, and this idea of forms, which kind of reminds me of Plato's archetypes and perfect forms. There is this realm beyond our realm where everything is perfect. And in our realm, it is imperfection and struggle. We have this, we inhere in this knowledge that their perfection is achievable, some heavenly ideal. But in our place, we toil with that knowledge, hoping to make, using that ideal as a prompt, I suppose, of making our lives a little bit more wiser and better lived. And so for Kristian, who had always seemed in his self-centeredness to have already been, at least in his mind, living in this ideal realm, just looking back at the rest of us in our imperfections, we now get the reverse of that and see Kristian, what if, this younger state, where he's sort of full of himself and with all this promise ahead of him was the ideal form, because the Kristian in part two is much diminished. Now, I took part two as very different, than when the younger Kristian, leaves behind his parents, and makes this decision that, they don't love me in the correct way. I'm moving on. I think that this divorce from daily life that we see Kristian in part two, this moving out to an island, I think is a little bit more for real. I think that he's affected by a profound grief. We don't know what it is, but he's out of this idealized, form of life, and has come into a time of turmoil, and toil. And I think that's very humanizing. So I think it's sort of subtly, built up, and some of the ideas about doubling in the photographs and then the Paul Becker character. And then it's put down in more concrete terms, like, okay, well, Kristian has, this double of him. There's another aspect to him that exists. So even when we're back, after the short interlude, of seeing him older, now we have the knowledge, or I think that we have the knowledge that he's the older guy on the island is writing this story. And I hate to use the word meta because I don't think it quite applies, but it does add an extra dimension, because I think that in revisiting, his more youthful self, I think that he is trying to lay bare, Kristian is in his older form, lay bare, some of the sins, of his younger self, and just look at it with an open eye. And that seems to cast a different sort of light, for me in any case, of what we read before. Because I think here's someone who's come to some crucible of experiences, living off on an island, not just in the melodramatic, sort of Kristian way, but in someone who's really come to a profound grief. And knowing that, just that small little glimpse of that life, changes my perspective, a little bit about him.
Yeah, we see him. He's on this island off the coast of Norway, very thinly populated place. And I was shocked when he's on this boat, uh, that the neighbor boy is taking him across to, go get provisions. He just kind of inexplicably starts to sob, which is something very different from the Kristian
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we've been accustomed to in part one. So there obviously has been some growth that has happened, but we still get the sense that he's at a very despairing place in his life.
yeah,
He comments about not having the courage to commit suicide. Um, he talks about writing this book that we're obviously now reading, um, and saying that he doesn't find the writing cathartic necessarily, but it kind of helps the despair in a lot of ways. It's not giving meaning to his life, but at least during the time that he's at the typewriter, which he finds in this house that he's staying at, he's not he's not in total despair.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that the typewriter that he finds, it's this older model, isn't it? So I mean, there's resistance in those keys, so it's an object of labor too. You know, it's not just an exercise of the mind. He's having to kind of pound on these keys, you know, to make it known. And his only way to get paper, it's interesting, this Faulkner-like man-child, you know, who delivers him on this boat, you know, across the sea, you know, to get paper and provisions. And it's up to, you know, his guide, I guess, to talk to the people in the neighborhood. And Kristian, you know, doesn't. You know, he's like that shadow, presumably, you know, maybe the shadow that was in the photograph that his teacher finally recognized, that, you know, hey, there is real talent here. You know, that self-portrait with the shadow that he only notices,
Yeah.
you know, then looking at it, you know, just before presentation. And it's interesting that, you know, we're now in pretty close proximity to that discovery, you know, with something of a shadow life, you know, here that he's living. But yeah, I do get a very different sense of Kristian now, having read part two, than originally there. And I think, you know, Knausgaard is just, you know, he understands, you know, how novels are put together, and just knows basically, I suppose, how much we can take as a reader, you know, and then when it's time to introduce newer information, especially since he's not going to introduce any sort of metaphysical happenings. You know, he's going to stick with something of a documentary style, but he definitely wants to tell a Faustus story, you know. And so the way some of these details are just sort of go off like time bombs sometimes, you know, it's like, maybe that's a metaphysical occurrence, because like you said, you know, that his release from jail and everything that changes after that has to be, or it's suggestion of, you know, something of magic, you know, which Hans, you know, always seems to suggest as well. But we don't
Yes.
see like a puff of smoke in there if we go.
Right. And we do get this sense, though, that something terrible has happened before Christian goes to this island.
Yeah.
When we do pick up with the story where we left off with Hans, um, I was I was struck by you know, this discussion that the two of them have, and Hans again repeats, "You're free." Someone else has confessed to the crime.
Yeah.
But then he also says, "You owe me a favor," which has a very ominous ring to it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that Hans is the Mephistopheles character, you know, in the Marlowe's Faustus play, you know, and to an extent, you know, how Mephistopheles is present in Goethe, which I don't think that this text, The School of Night, you know, pulls from Goethe all that much. You know, it sticks with Marlowe's. But interwrapped in all of that, you know, is this Calvinist argument that has come up subsequent to when Marlowe first put on the play. Scholars in the 1800s, you know, up to today, you know, wonder how much of Calvinist belief, this idea of predestination, you know, that in Marlowe's play, you know, Faustus, you know, goes ahead and takes the the bargain that will allow him to live more magically, you know, in the world, knowing that he's probably not one of the select in the Calvinist sense of things that goes on to heaven. So why not just go ahead, you know, and speak a denial, you know, of heavenly passage, and just enjoy this time of magic, knowing that I'm probably not going to pass through anyway. And so there's this idea maybe that Kristian is coming to of selection, you know, or you know, or favor. There's this sort of Calvinistic, you know, gatekeeping, you know, and Hans somehow plays a part in that. You know, it's like, here you can you're sort of damned, I suppose, in a sense, just being Kristian, just being who you are, you know. And it's pretty obvious too that Kristian doesn't take that much pleasure out of life. He talks himself out of what could be some good relationships with people, and talks himself out of, you know, all sorts of things, you know, by overthinking and overanalyzing, you know, and such. But you know, here is a way to live in the world a little bit more magically, you know, the way of Hans and Vivian, you know, who are up to some interesting things. And the whole drama, you know, around Marlowe's play is like this guy who's given up on science, right? And wants to live more magically. And and I think that's Christian's thing too. That these rigorous rules within his photography, the evenness of the light and the symmetry and all of these things, he only really starts to get good when he moves past that into that undefinable thing that makes something rise from the particular into the universal, which is just almost like a divine utterance, kind of how art works, something that is both familiar and new, shockingly new at the same time. Only, after, this experience does that sort of come into him. It's like almost though he gives up this sort of scientific based thinking about his photographs and the way that he looks at his art, and is open more to automatic, forms. And there, of course, always, anytime he's moving and he's thinking about these things, there's Hans and the way that he practices.
Yeah. Um, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this statement, "You owe me a favor," might be the last thing that Hans says to Kristian before Hans skips town.
Yep.
Kristian tries to go visit him at the studio,
Yep.
um, and discovers that, I think this is some weeks later. Kristian does this thing that he does throughout, where, he says, I'm done with Vivian and Hans. I don't need them anymore. But then, he always seems to be, um, to go back. And so when he visits, there's another guy living in Hans's studio. Um, there's a very disgusting scene that happens because the guy doesn't really want to give Kristian the time of day, and Kristian is very vengeful in how he responds to that. But the guy does give Kristian um, some photos that Hans apparently has left behind. And these photos are something that Kristian cannot figure out because they seem to have been taken in the 1600s, which is impossible because there wasn't the technology to photograph, or photography really wasn't invented as far as Kristian or anyone knows until much later.
Yeah, I mean, back to that favor, which I don't think at first I was reading as like, okay, now you owe me, like a personal favor. I don't think Hans was mentioning that at all. I think the favor has to do with this releasing of that magic, into the world a little bit, And of course, these paintings, I mean, these I suppose contact sheets, that Kristian finds, they're in a box, a little magic box, and of course it is. And it's this transaction of excrement, for the box. He leaves behind his own, feces as a final, gesture to the guy. But I mean, there's always that sort of connection. The Aztecs thought that gold was the fecal droppings of gods, and that's how we got art into the world. In their perfect realm, and in our imperfect realm, the droppings come into us, and of course we try to shape these things into something that resembles perfection. And in folklore, I grew up in quite a remote rural area, and using scat and animal scat, as a way of warding off, other larger animals and stuff. There's something, of a folklorish practice, about these things, whether they work or not, or you're just sort of settling things in your own mind. So I think the hanging of the feces on the door, of this guy is marking it, in some kind of way, that's pretty interesting. And what Kristian gets in return from that is this box, this magical box that he can't quite figure out, these photos and stuff that must have something to do with alchemy through the ages. I like that moment very much in the book where he's sort of putting it together, silver nitrate, when it might have been invented, and trying to connect something scientific, to his theory that these images might have been taken. That might actually be, photos of Marlowe and stuff. But I think he's also kind of coming to reckoning with what that favor that Hans is asking of him. It's like to portray the magic, to carry it forward. Even reluctant as you are, your fascination with this is as such that it's not going to let go. So you're now the vessel, to sharing it into the world. And I don't think it's necessarily a friendly sort of magic, or certainly don't get that sense with Kristian, almost like Dr. Frankenstein at the end, just living remotely, as his monster has affected him to such a degree that he's distorted, from his younger self and his younger ambitions quite a bit.
Yeah. Um, just like kind of saying I'm done with Hans and then going back to him. Uh Christian takes Liz, the next door neighbor who he becomes, I won't say romantically involved, but sexually involved with, um, to the theater to see this play that of Dr. Faustus, or a rendition of Dr. Faustus play by Marlowe, and his reaction to seeing that is very interesting. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. He says that he found it, you know, terribly wrong. He felt that the world was unraveling, and he talks about his horror at watching it.
Mhm.
So, do you think this is maybe because it's a little too close to home, or what do you think is going on here?
I think so. I think this is about as metaphysical as Nausgaard's going to get, to describing the transformation, of Kristian. And of course, he gives us a lot to work with, with the Faustus play, what we're seeing, these images that shouldn't exist, but somehow do. It's interesting to me that the rest of the audience watching probably is just looking at the pictures as part of the production without any sort of. It's like, oh yeah, those are very. It's very interesting to see these moving images. They're not like Kristian, who's taken more of a forensic look at them, coming to the conclusion that they're probably, from a time before this sort of recording technology ever existed. Everyone else in the audience, he's alone in this experience, or seemingly. Liz, who, I think would be a terrific romantic partner for him, if he could ever, move past himself a little bit, someone who understands literature, and would be a good partner in a lot of ways. Is certainly not his ideal. We get that, but I think there is something about Kristian um, that uh, you know some sort of automatic response to Liz, that he needs some help. There is a dimension to the personality, that I think is beyond our regular control, but it is there, and it does influence our behavior. And it's whenever we go into bouts of like offline thinking, or when we, find ourselves sort of shut down for a moment, imagining working through a problem, in a way, and kind of snap back towards a reverie. These things sort of happen, and I think it's part of the it's like a sneeze, it's an involuntary action of the body to help us out, to get away the sources of infection or something. And I think we kind of zone out from time to time as a way for the mind and the body to like it's a healing sort of gesture. And I think there's something in this that is attracting him, Kristian, to Liz. It's like this is a more healthy relationship, or here's someone who could be of help to you. And he's doing his best efforts, to offer impediments to that. But I think on some level he understands that she can be of help, and she does hold his hand at exactly the right moment. And all these years later, Kristian, writing about this, does talk about that gesture. He's at a moment of where he understands the world. Yeah, at its he's at his least point of understanding about the world and about art, and someone holds his hand at that moment. And I think that that's kind of a crucial gesture. I don't get the impression that it goes past that, but I think it is an interesting detail.
Well, he's this relationship with Liz, it's so obvious that he refuses to let himself be vulnerable around another
Yeah,
person, because
yeah.
he keeps talking about needing to get the upper hand, with her.
Who does that? It's just
Yeah, I
well,
don't
lots of
know.
people, but it's not good. Yeah,
It's not good at all. So another influence on Christian, although it's almost as an afterthought, or seems like an afterthought, because he's not really willing to acknowledge to himself the influence that Vivian and Hans have had on him and the way that he thinks about his art. But is this it's this character that Knausgaard has created, the Austrian poet Paul Becker. And Paul Becker's, I think they said, only novel, which is Paramenides' Secret. And Kristian is reading this, and this kind of, I think, uh, bounces off the whole Faustian idea. There are lines in the novel that Kristian reads that life was the night, death the day. It's the living who were dead and the dead who were living. And in all of these thoughts that are going through Kristian's mind, the 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 photos he finds of Hans, his own work, the play, this book. There's this there's this sense of time and this element of the past not really being the past, the dead not really being dead, the living perhaps not even really being living. It's not necessarily in my mind yet, and I'm still trying to get my head around it, a circular concept of time. But do you do you have an explanation for what's going on here with time?
Well, it is very, complex, and kind of profound. And I'll go back to that. What I think is being described, at least in some sense, are these two spheres of existence. This idea of a more perfect, reality. Our notion of heaven, that our toil here, brings us, to good favor there. And that's a lot of how we perceive time. Or even if, the idea of the double, which has been around with us since we first started telling stories, that there is, I get this sense about myself that there is another reality of mine that's being lived. And maybe, the stuff that I'm going through today is a way of making that other, a doppelganger, or what have you, live a more successful or wise life. Or maybe the other end of things is like, hey, things are going pretty great. I would certainly hate to jinx that. I do imagine, some form of myself, understanding the struggles of daily life. Maybe there's some iteration of me, that portion of the swan below the water, that's paddling, that allows me, to move along with grace. This idea of doubling, in our own nature. And I think our understanding of time, certainly, in the Christian era, or anyone who's moved in something of a spiritual, religious way, this idea of fulfillment. Time comes through, the revelation of ourselves or to God. We're moving in that direction, presumably. But what if, I get from Becker's discourse, or his appearance in it, that more perfect realm is the one that we're living in, that the best of all possible worlds is this one of distortions, shadows, corruptions, death, and that the other realm, rather like Virgil puts it, in the Aeneid, the gates of horn and ivory, where the dead sort of send these messages, to the living, these corrupting thoughts and stuff. What if that's actually the way that things are? And that our best way to understand time and to move time effectively is to maybe intercept some of these messages or use them to our advantage. I certainly get the sense that Hans is using other sorts of influence, in his art. He is not, like Kristian, devoted to becoming a person in time of renown. Probably because he's hundreds of years old, maybe moving through the world and doesn't want to call attention to himself. But he lives artfully. He makes these pests, that are robotic, and obey his heed and stuff. And perhaps Vivian is the same way. She's a very good artist, but not one who wants to stand out in time because maybe she has a different view of time, and eternity. And I think that Kristian's sense of time, it's like, the young man in a hurry, is starting to get distorted too. So I think time is going through, a little bit of an air pocket, that makes things a little bit unusual. Because when we think about our life, it's easy to think, that of this road unfurling, out. But when we really examine it, it's like all these different simultaneities, these different things that came in and upset us or knocked us off course, or maybe we overcorrected the course, and maybe, it's just more like string theory, just all of these simultaneities at the same time. But I think Kristian is getting the sense, about time, that it's not that linear thing. Certainly not in his ambitions. You go from your apprentice stage to your mastery stage. I think all of that's getting distorted, and I think that also his idea that, okay, moving past, some of the rigors and of being in my apprentice stage, to find happiness later. Well, he doesn't find that happiness, so that's a distortion of what he thinks fulfillment, and time will be. So I think we're playing around with it in very poetic terms, with the Paul Becker character, that it's not what you think it is. It's like we move through, by gradations, toward some sense of fullness of self, or toward perfection, that it's always just navigating and negotiating, like the waves, at sea, and it becomes a little bit more complex. And the more that we open ourselves to those sorts of things, maybe the more we open ourselves to ideas of magic and very uncomfortable thoughts about selfhood and time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I had to look up to see whether Paul Becker was a real
I
a
did
real
too. I think
person.
everybody did. He seems
Um,
perfectly real.
he does, and especially, that there is, we get some biographical information about him in part one, that Christian supposedly, looks up from, a reference book that he borrows from Liz, and then we've got, Christian reading this novel that of Becker's that, we get full paragraphs of.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it was Diane, one of the readers, who mentioned that, there's got to be great significance to the fact that this guy is in here. And she even talked about, she said she looked up Paramitides, I guess is
Hmm.
his name, and to see what he was all about too. Um, and I don't know much about him. Do you know much about?
Only what I read in the post, which I found was very
Yeah,
informative, on
yeah,
Dana's part. I'm very grateful for that. But it kind of goes back to those gates of horn and ivory. It's like these truths, and these fantasies, that somehow, inform our lives, and it becomes kind of nebulous in that way. And I like that very much. I think that Becker's inserted into the novel, as a way, not just as a device, but just as a way of introducing these metaphysical thoughts, the unconscious, the dreams, and how we're susceptible, to thoughts that are definitely our own, but not controlled by us in some way. I think that's just a way of bringing that into the novel that Knausgaard, acting as Kristian, both younger and older, wouldn't be able to introduce, because Kristian, the character, it wouldn't make sense. But it's a way of bringing, that into the narrative, I think, in a
yeah.
in a pretty interesting way.
So we talked about what Christian owes Hans, and also kind of how that is manifesting or will manifest itself. And there's this transformation that's occurring in Christian's work after he is released and freed. Um, and I understand from the Marlowe play um, that Dr. Faustus very intentionally asks, Mephistopheles, to or his friends actually, to bring this magic into his life, this evil dark magic.
Hmm.
And there seems to be something, to me at least, perhaps less intentional here on Christian's part. So does he have agency here in asking this dark magic to be in come into his life? It feels like, he does make the one call to Hans,
Yeah.
hey, can you can you help me out here? But he doesn't necessarily expect Hans to be able to just, I think, free him like that. And I don't know. It seems to me that Christian is a little bit acting intentionally with some agency, but in part, he's kind of stumbling into this this destiny, or this dark magic that he now, I get the feeling he's going to more and more embrace it, because he's seeing the effect that it's having on his work. But it's almost like he's getting into it in a way that he doesn't quite know what he's getting into.
I
To
agree. Yeah, it's mystery. A different sort of writer would give us that moment with Christian in his cell. It's like, oh, I've got to be delivered from this. This sort of like breaking point. Hitting that bottom and then reaching out. For a service from the beyond. Some sort of commerce with the beyond to make things right. One of those foxhole sort of prayers. It's like, if I can just get out of this, I'll live differently. Never gets that scene. He's just in his cell, kind of cooling his heels, and then someone confesses, and that's very strange. What compelled? Maybe it's the truth. Somebody else did come along, and stomp, poor Ian there. But there's a confession. Could it be of someone else who owed Hans a favor? That's interesting. It could be, this type of favor that Christian owes later on. But we don't get that scene, which invites the metaphysical, or resolution, or the magic, to descend, from the rafters, and to help him out. We don't get that. He's just, the next thing we know, he's into it, to this. And I believe that some sort of transference took place. I think some sort of agreement was reached, but it was so subtle that it's elusive to me, and certainly elusive to Christian. It's interesting to me. He's noticing the change in his photography. He gets it, that things are better. I like it that he spends a couple of paragraphs almost in this Malcolm Gladwell sort of mode, which makes it my least favorite part of the book. But I mean, this idea, that, okay, well, I've been putting in the hours, so it's only natural, that after 10,000 hours or so, that I'll be reaching, something of mastery, or these decisions will be automatic. But mercifully, he sort of puts that aside, and just sort of like, for a moment, or it seems to me, just relishes the fact that there is something extra dimensional, coming into his photographs, and giving him that life. There is just something about the moment when he clicked, where the other homeless person, with the lighter or something, that makes them an unexpected move or gesture on the subject's part, or an unexpected, calmness, in the landscape or something. That somehow he's able to get. There is a mastery that is magical, and I think that he's moved past this. I get the impression that in a very short period of narrative space, that Christian moved past this idea. Well, it's not just the accumulation of hours and all of a sudden breakthrough. There's something else, that's starting to happen here as well. Then we kind of leave that, and it's Liz and off to the play. But I mean, I think that there is, and probably more to come later. But I'm like you, I missed a point, that would suggest that here is, that big change. It's just all sort of relayed subtly, and I think that's why we're supposed to focus on, on the extra poets, people like Becker, and the sister, lives liminal state, between narcotized state of existence, and or choosing another form of existence, which is the clean and purity, lurking in the background. Christian's whole split, with his family, has to do with his sisters. Almost, she's not Sleeping Beauty, but she is this narcotized sort of person, neither here nor there, and the family wants to rally around to help her. And I don't think that Christian, in his mind at any other point, could have seen it as anything other than just weakness, and not maybe a spiritual malaise or something else like that. And so, but then of course, the part two ends with news about Liv and the sister. And so I
Yeah.
think that he's starting to come to some conclusions that maybe, there's not this deterministic, value of life, that he's not one of the Calvinistic type select, to be this great artist and happy person, that there's, a lot of vagaries and some forces that suggest to seem, like magic. And so I think he's having a little bit of a moment toward a breakdown or toward a crisis that Liz, for a moment, helps him with. Of course, we don't get to see the conclusion of that scene, how the rest of the play played out, or if indeed Kristian. I would love to have seen, if after the play that Kristian saw, Vivian again or Hans again, but we just we leave it off of that handheld gesture, which I think is a very interesting, a unity for Kristian that we hadn't seen him. I don't think that we've seen him, have before.
Yeah. And maybe I'm being repetitive, but we don't see this explicit summonsing by
Yes.
Kristian for dark magic, but there is, even to his you know acknowledgement that there's some leap in his work, in the quality of his work. And I agree with you that that he seems to accept, although he doesn't quite see it yet as magic, I don't think,
No.
but uh but that it's more than just, oh well, this is not just reaching, shooting up to a new plateau,
Yeah.
like the this something else is going on here. um what other themes or observations or things would you like to talk about from part two?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm always interested, in the fire signs, that we see in his books. I was reminded as I was thinking about the two, the dualism, the doubling, the characters, and the self of toil and the aspirations to the self of a wiser, and a wiser self, and one that has more access to the things of joy in the world, and how these sides don't always, mesh within us, and we can feel troubled and separate instead of unified, and whole. And I was thinking about this novel, of course, is part of he calls it a constellation of novels under the sign of the morning star, and I wonder which if it isn't if this morning star isn't something like the star wormwood, from Revelation, which arches like a torch across the sky, and makes everything bitter. I think Kristian comes to, we get sense in part two, a fallen world, or certainly a fallen world for him. And I think this time of of ideals, does fall away. I don't think, instead of, we sort of go in a reverse mechanism from a time of struggle into a time of revelation, and better health. I think we go from a time of struggle into a time where things could even be a little bit worse. That our time now might be you know, Knausgaard might be suggesting that this is our ideal time, and I think that a couple of signs that point to that, are the business with the lighter, in the Enlightenment myth, the idea is that we have this torch, our understanding, our experience in the world, our perceptions. If we use that flame, of that experience to light another person's, torch, then we're passing on the light, from generation to generation. We're making sure that no one is left in the dark. That is the fullness of the Enlightenment, experience. That's where that symbol comes from, just lighting another's torch, or that image, that concept arrives from. And it's not too far to think about the Prometheus myth, who took pity, on humankind and our coldness and suffering, and stole fire from the gods to bring it back, knowing all the while that there was going to be some punishment for that, but accepting it. Better to do a good service. Kristian offers a light to the guy, to a guy, and it goes very, very badly. It ends in not in enlightenment, but in death. And I think that's one of these little, transformations that is happening in the novel, that shows that we're not going toward any sort of a better or enlightened place, but maybe toward a darkened place. And maybe that's why some of the complexity of not understanding, Kristian's journey, or the bargain that he's reaching with Hans. Maybe it's like the fruit in the garden. It's like it just gives you the knowledge of good and evil. Maybe he now has this knowledge that times are, or that the world is full of forces that that can lead one toward pessimism, about the future, and even his pictures, which have they're not sinister, but they are magical in a way that suggests, I don't know, there's a darkness to them, an appealing sort of darkness that I think that works. And so I think how light and dark work within the novel, images of enlightenment, images of punishment, for enlightenment, the morning star, wormwood, a light that falls and makes everything bitter, I think are signs, that might suggest how we're supposed to take Kristian's transformation as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that Knausgaard does a really good job with this Faustian theme, because in some respects it might seem that he's hitting us over the head with it, because they're putting on the play, um, and all of these other things, but there is, for me, this subtlety, this ambiguity about how all of this is working inside of Kristian, and as a reflection, you know, of how his art is turning out as well. I guess maybe it'd be interesting, uh, to me, Richard, in addition to your work at the bookstore with me, you're a filmmaker yourself and an artist, and I'm wondering, you know, it feels like this is a very realistic portrayal of influences that hit an artist, and how it might not be obvious. You're obviously not going to replicate another person's art, but how these influences kind of work inside of an artist in ways that maybe they don't even see uh, themselves, but manifest in a way that maybe other people can see the influences better than even you can yourself.
Yeah, I think the only difference for someone who feels moved to whether make a movie, or a novel or a painting, is just receptivity, a sort of antenna. And when we all get these all sorts of influences, and ideas, but there's something about someone who then feels that the only way to remove a for lack of a better term, like a haunted sense. It's like, here's a message, that I can't quite figure out, but I would like to sort of figure out. And I have these tools for me as a filmmaker, understanding, with the camera, and again, how light works, and how images can go together or not go together in interesting ways, the tensions of putting certain types of images together. Let's see if I can use those skills to describe something that's kind of ineffable, troubling, but also something that I recognize as universal, because that's only when art is successful, something that moves us past a particular idea of someone or a particular epiphany. But then you got to make it, that others can say, ah, yes, that's an interesting way of phrasing that question, or rephrasing that question, and I think that I think that's really it. I don't think that there's any sort of Calvinistic, selection for who's an artist and who's not. It's just like, how you what you do with that, I suppose, calling. It's like, okay, here's something that you receive, an idea or some information. There is something within one that makes you think, okay, you've got to put that in another form. Wouldn't that be interesting to do? And here's that doubling again, right? How do you get this mental image, externalized, something private and fantastical to oneself, externalized into public form, and that's there are people who just are moved to do that. There are people who are, people are wonderful. We're moved to do all sorts of things, and an artist is just someone who's moved to do something like that. And I don't think that there's anything precious about that. I don't think there's anything selective. I just think that that's the work of society, right? I could go on probably an unwelcome diatribe and talk about how we sort of infantilize, art in the world today and culture in today. It's never an extravagance. It is a necessity, and so I think that we should be more welcoming of people who are able to do these sorts of things, and more hospitable to the way that they do it. But I think, yeah, it's operating with signals and then just trying to put them into to a form that's somewhat understandable. Kind of goes back to our time of being afraid, on the plains or in the forest or ancient selves. It's like there is something out there in the woods that is scaring me. You pick up some chalk, you go to the cave wall, and I think it looks like this. You know, and once you give it form, or a symbol, then everyone else says, yeah, we're going to put it to that. Now we've got, a way of our cave society of talking about this thing that's been troubling us. And we come to an understanding about it. Now it's not just undefined fear. We can locate it in something. We can talk about it. We can make stories to make ourselves feel better about it. And art goes back to those ancient sensibilities. It's like, there's something out there that's a little bit disturbing. Let's localize it in some way that we can then discuss it, using the tools at hand, whether it's a rock that makes a mark on a cave, or a photograph, or a painting, or a motion picture.
Yeah. Well, in fact, this idea of externalizing what is internal
Yeah.
is something that is explicitly stated in this nonlinear section, at the end of it, when he's talking about Christian's talking about the writing process and what the writing was doing. He says, and gradually, from being something inside me which no one knew anything about, what had happened to me changed and became something external. Word after word, day after day, page after page. So that's exactly kind of what you're saying in terms of the process of making art.
But it's interesting. We know that he's talking specifically about writing there. But if you just take that, that bit of language out of context, you're talking about someone who might be conjuring, making a spell or something. It's like,
Ah,
ooh, then it sounds a little bit, odd and strange. There's that fine line there, taken just with a different sort of context, or just removed of context. Everything you just described in that passage there suggests someone who's maybe up to a little bit of necromancy or something.
yeah, yeah. Is is this your first Knausgaard book, Richard? What's your
It's
experience reading him?
not. I am by no means a specialist. I read the first in my struggle. The first book there. With great enthusiasm. I was like, most everybody else who read it was just amazed by it. And then I read this interesting sort of departure of his, the seasonal quartet. Which is something that Knausgaard wrote for his children, and it's these very brief, discrete, I guess, ideas, or sort of poetic little essays about things, whether it's public parks, public toilets, the conversations that he's had with his children, explaining the mundane to them, in a way that is delightful, for young people, and delightful for us as the reader. It's almost a different sort of Knausgaard. I mean, those that attention to detail is there, but there's also, a sort of an uplift. It's an optimism, or so it seems to me. And those books are just absolutely delightful. And then I read the first of this, I guess, somewhat of a series called the Morning Star, which has 9 different speakers. I think for the first time, removing himself from like one person, telling us the whole story, or him, in my struggle, giving us these different voices, which seemed to me like a liberating gesture for him. I just love that book. I love the different speakers, that came through to it. Supposedly, there's some connection. Supposedly, Kristian is in there somewhere. I missed it, and I think other people have said too that these books aren't especially interconnected, but maybe in their themes. So I read the Morning Star, I read the Quartet, and the first in my struggle. And this one, The School of Night, is my favorite, of them all. And I think I've said this before, that not only in his canon, but where it stands in the canon of literature on Faust, it's right up there. I certainly enjoy this more than I enjoyed Marlowe's play, and I enjoy this. This is hard to say, more than Goethe's Dr. Faustus, which is something I always thought of as a high artistic achievement, one of the best pieces of imaginative writing that we have. But there's just something about this novel that I'm that just I'm not looking at it like with Goethe, like, just a sense of, oh, look at these sentences and stuff. I'm really connecting, I feel like, in this with this novel in a way that maybe I hadn't connected with any of the Faustus stories before. We'll see with Thomas Mann. I haven't read that one yet. That one's coming up, but I do put this, just up there, in that high spot in literature, dealing with the Faustus myth, and the only one of them that doesn't look at Faust, doesn't tell a metaphysical, story,
Yeah.
that doesn't have this expressive sort of language, to get you in the mood for those Gothic transformations, but instead gives us a very different sort of language. It's a great achievement.
Yeah. Maybe like the Morning Star, if you blink, you might have missed the reference to Christian. I haven't read the Morning Star yet, but the star is in the School of Night very briefly in part one, in one of the early uh sections of the book. It's just, I think that looks out the window and there's this star and he's wondering if it might be a UFO, and then it's just it the reference, it's gone. I don't know whether it'll come back up again. But yeah, it I think it will be so interesting to see when this project is completed, when we get I guess there's going to be six novels, I think, six or seven,
Wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, yeah.
kind of how they're all going to, to fit together, because by all accounts of what I've read, they seem very loosely
Oh,
connected.
I think that's the big appeal of the way that he writes. It's not like some combination lock, where you have to get all the tumblers to match. Oh, this symbol means this, or I won't have access to this unless I, find these one-to-one correlatives with other literatures. I've been kind of going on at length about, some of the allusions to other literatures and things like that, which is not at all necessary, to get this book or to enjoy this book. They're cards that are laid down. I choose to pick them up, and play with them a little bit, but not one doesn't have to, of course. And Knausgaard's style is not, to make us, do studious work or homework. He's just, doing the arts. There is some connectivity here. I'm just going to let it, sort of play out, as opposed to this very detailed map, of how things work together. He's not like, like Dante in that regard, where there's a physics, to how we move through these realms. There's just a guy writing, and his influences. And I don't know much about him as an individual or his style, but I get the sense that he just kind of goes,
Yeah.
it just kind of goes with the influence and trusts, which I love, trust that influence instead of, someone like Kristian trying to shape and rethink and, and maybe miss the other point. So I think all of his books are going to be long. I think all of his books are going to have some interconnectivity, but it's not going to be, these one-to-one correlatives. Aha, now this makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just a greater unfurling, and I just love. I think there's something more generous about that as a writer, than someone who wants us to, to connect certain symbols and unlock certain doors. A dark academia novel. I find those less enjoyable than something like this that is smart, maybe on levels and ways that I don't always catch, but I just love the atmosphere of it.
Well, he certainly is generous in his production, because I don't know how he does it. He just writes these big books, to my delight, but there's
Yeah,
uh he doesn't seem to be the type of writer that needs to sit and contemplate, an idea for 10 years. He's
yeah,
just going all the
yeah,
time.
yeah. That is remarkable to me, and but I think he's also, writing with a sense of his books in the world, for a long time. I don't think it's necessarily like, oh, we have to keep up. I, there are some completists who are like, going from book to book, and seemingly all they'll ever read is Knausgaard because he just does these things. But I think he's got a different idea, about his books in time, and I think that he's just, I don't know. I mean, I know that he has children. I know that writing didn't always, pay for things in the family. So I assume he's got, obligations, like the rest of us. But I would always rather see someone putting work out as opposed to, oh, I'm going to purposefully be judicious, and hold on to something like this. I mean, I love the appeal of, like, someone who just writes one book, and that, the Paul Becker character, it's like, and then disappears. There's always something interesting about that. But I don't think it reduces. I don't think a lot of content reduces an artist, or dilutes anything, unless there's some sort of terrible drop off. But we don't get that sense. It's like, just let them go. Life is short.
Yeah.
And all these novels can only be good things. If we can't get to them all, maybe other generations will.
Well, thank you, Richard, for a delightful conversation. I think that everyone that listens to this will understand the profound joy that I get to experience every time I spend my day in the store with you and we get to talk about books, because you're a wonderful person to talk to about literature and ideas, and I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this book with us.
Well, that's all manifest of the story you curate, Lori. I do appreciate that, you saying that, and thank you so much. And of course, what you've built through this podcast and through that store are just luminous details in the culture. And so, thank you so much for those things too.
All right. Well, I can't wait to see what's going to happen in part 3 of this book.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about it.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right, thank you so much.